Hello, and welcome back to the Your Body Has Your Back podcast. Today, we are bringing in our very first guest on the podcast, and we could not think of a better person to bring in than Sarah Marlette. Sarah is one of our friends, our colleagues, and is just an all-around wonderful human. We're super excited to have Sarah on as our first guest. A little bit about Sarah. So Sarah is a functional medicine licensed nutritionist. She has a master's of science in human nutrition and functional medicine. She's a certified nutrition specialist, and she is the creator of Nourish, Thrive, Glow. Sarah helps women from all walks of life looking to improve their health, from hormonal and gut imbalances to improving their lifestyle and nutrition using a realistic, evidence-based approach. Sarah, we are so jazzed to have you on as our first guest.
Guys, I am so excited and honored to be here. I've been looking forward to this all week. And yeah, I just can't wait to chat, share our knowledge, and all that good stuff.
I know I was giggling like coming into this, but I was like, ooh, we're taking like our coffee conversations because we'll do like coffee chats in our like personal lives. And I'm like, we're taking them into like the public. Like now everyone gets to be inside of our like wandering conversations. So I'm like, strap in, everybody. Well, we'd love to like, certainly, Jillian and I have shared some of our story kind of on the podcast of like how we kind of found ourselves in the positions that we are. And I feel like so many of us in this kind of professional space have a personal story or an element that kind of led them into like what they do today. And we'd love to hear and kind of share some of your like personal story that's kind of gotten you to like where you are and what your messages are and what you're about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll keep a long story short. Otherwise, it'll be like the whole podcast. I always say, like when people ask me, I always say like my passion grew from pain, right? So growing up, I struggled with weight. I was overweight. I dealt with skin issues and took a very much Band-Aid approach, right? It was like, I'll be 35. I was born in the late 80s. So it wasn't like holistic and medicine like wasn't really a thing. So went on the pill, was given antibiotics for my skin, and was like kind of sent off my way. And I didn't really think too much about it, like lost the weight by, doing extreme caloric restriction, and everything seemed fine until I got into my 20s and early 20s. And I started to kind of feel shitty, right? Like skin started acting up again, was bloated, painful periods came back. And I was just told, okay, like, here's another antibiotic, here's a topical, and, we'll switch your birth control and you should be fine. And it was just like, there's got to be another way, like constantly putting this into my body because then I'd be so bloated after the antibiotic for my skin, it would clear up. And it was just kind of like this, it felt like a domino effect. I did one thing and then everything else fell apart. So I actually started out my career in public relations and worked in like a hospital setting. So predominantly with like neuroendovascular physicians. And it was also during that time that I was just like really struggling where I'm like, I'm so exhausted. I am the youngest person in this room. Like what is going on? So I did a whole 180, went back to school, got my master's, became a CNS, did the boards, did, my clinical internship. And it was sort of like during that time from like transitioning back into school, I realized there was another way. And then I realized I probably wasn't the only woman that was going through this sort of like, God, I didn't outgrow my acne. Like what the hell's going on? Like I didn't outgrow my stomach issues. Like nobody else in my family like really has like such strong issues like this. Like, something's not making sense. So fast forward, I always say kind of reiterating my passion grew from pain and just wanted to help myself and then wanted to help my anxiety, all of these things. I wanted to feel like I wasn't constantly waging a war against my body because I was like, I'd get to a place where I'm like, oh, I'm happy. But then it was like I had to hold the line and I had to do so much restriction. And then I had to have a Red Bull and a coffee to have energy. And it's like, oh my God, I'm 25 years old. Like this shouldn't be the way it is. And so fast forward to where I am now, I just want to help, just like you guys, I just want to help women realize that there's other options and you don't have to suffer in silence and you don't have to isolate yourself socially to heal, that there is a balance and you can find that balance.
I love that. And it really kind of speaks to the whole premise of this podcast in terms of your body has your back and breaking that cycle of fighting against yourself and, forcing, kind of strategies to Band-Aid symptoms and, kind of ending up on that hamster wheel. So I know we can definitely relate to your story and so many of our listeners can as well.
No, I was just going to say like, yeah, I felt like I was on a hamster wheel or like a merry-go-round. And like every time I tried to step off, like all the symptoms returned, right? Or like I was more anxious or I was more this and like losing my hairs. So yeah, it totally felt like a hamster wheel or a merry-go-round that if I took one step out, like the whole thing crumbled.
Which is just not a good feeling. And, I think it's really cool to be able to now, provide women with the tools that you didn't have, access to support healing. So I want to kind of dive into the kind of topic, the meat of the topic for this podcast today, which is anti-aging like Benjamin Button. So, could you tell us what that means to you in terms of like, aging or anti-aging like Benjamin Button?
I love that so much. So I feel like this is definitely taking our coffee chats to like the masses, which is so great. So
Yes.
I think we're all right. So when I think of aging, I'm not thinking of like wrinkles and, oh my God, my hair is turning gray. I'm more thinking of like what's kind of occurring on that cellular level. And what most researchers and scientists suggest is that it all happens in our molecules and then it goes from there. So in graduate school, I took a really strong interest in a topic called circadian rhythms. And there was a theme across the board that what seems to be aging our population the fastest is a disruption in these rhythms, which these are just little internal clocks that help to control routines and rhythms for our body, right? So they control behavioral, mental, or physical changes. They operate roughly on like a 24-hour clock. And what research has kind of has suggested for a while, but even more so, with the abundance amount of research that's occurring is that a disruption to these rhythms is increasing our risk for chronic disease, decreased immunity, obesity, metabolic syndrome, sarcopenia, which is a topic that I don't think a lot of people talk a ton about, but that loss of muscle, right? And as women, we know as we age, we're going to be losing muscle with the loss of estrogen. So we're in an uphill battle more than men. So I think when it comes to aging well, and I feel like I'm reiterating everything you guys talk about, but it's like having your foundations in place, because without the foundations, it's going to be this constant uphill battle. And if we think about, some of the genes that control for aging and how stress and sleep impact everything, it's just such a slippery slope. So if we're talking about like aging like Benjamin Button, I think it's having your foundations in check and making sure you're supporting your rhythms daily through really basic fundamental things, not like, and I love these things, but it's not like going to like an ozone bar and getting an IV and like, taking 18,000 supplements. Like that's not the key. And that's going to do nothing if you don't have your foundations in place.
Yeah. And I think what's so,
do you hear that, everyone?
Are you seriously? And I think, what, of course I said seriously in my series, like, yes, can I help you? What's so interesting though, is like, from your story of like, that merry-go-round that like you're paralyzed on because of fear. It's like fear that I step off the merry-go-round and like eat breakfast in the morning instead of doing a long fast until like noon or 1 p.m. Or so it's like we're challenged, we're limited to our merry-go-round because of fear, but then really looking at like, oh, like all of these like practices like are aligning with like how our bodies like want to be supported, but like that chasm between like my fear and the merry-go-round and like those big rock foundations is like everything that we have to like unravel from our wiring that we were, grew up around or kind of inundated with through like multiple different pathways.
So true. And you said the fear of breakfast. I mean, that was like as a reformed long-term hardcore faster, like low carb zealous. I mean, the idea of breakfast like scared the shit out of me. Like when I was like on my healing journey and was like reading the literature and it was like, sunlight's so important, but the first bite of food also helps to reset, our liver clock, our gut clock, our pancreas clock. And I was like, holy shit, like I can't eat breakfast within 2 hours of waking. Like I have trained my body for the past year to just run off black coffee and stress hormones until noon. And then I'll just, I'll eat 3,000 calories in a sitting, right? Because I was like just so out of touch with my body. So that the fear is such a big one. And I think it's for so many women that I work with, and I'm sure you guys too, like the thought of having breakfast and being hungry in the morning, I was just like, no, like I'm a champion. I'm not hungry in the morning. Like, look at me go, but then my hair falling out and I'm so bloated all the time, but so much fear around breakfast.
It's crazy. And it's, it's something I think a lot of women can relate to. And it's been ingrained in a lot of us for, decades that you eat more, you gain weight. You eat more, you're less healthy. It's like all about, restriction, which is actually really the opposite of what we want to do in terms of, optimizing health and hormones in the gut and all of these things. And, I'm also curious to kind of get your take too, in terms of, working on the fundamentals with clients, which, Abby and I emphasize a lot in terms of, people are often not interested in the fundamentals, and they want, the IVs and the supplements and this and that. And, we're like bringing people back down to the basics. And it's like, oh, this can't possibly help my, issues. I need like the shiny things.
Totally. So, and I was that person for a while too, kind of had my blinders on and thought like, these people are idiots. They don't know what they're talking about. Like, give me the shiny ball, give me that instant gratification until like, temporarily it kind of works when you're stuck in that area of running off stress hormones. And for the first 2 months, you feel amazing. And maybe you're a little bit more lean and whatever it might be. So a couple of things that have really worked for me and my clients, with kind of coming from that more of like restrictive behaviors of fasting is I created, and I don't mean I created like this per se, but a version of, what I call my metabolism coffee or matcha. So it's taking decaf, espresso, or matcha. It's adding some collagen to it or plant-based protein if you're vegan, a little bit of fiber, and that can kind of vary along the lines. There's an acacia fiber I like to use or a resistant starch. I give my clients the choice to use their own like liquid. I think your morning warm beverage brings you typically a lot of joy. So if somebody wants to use a little milk or oat milk or nut milk or macadamia nut milk, like whatever they want, they use their milk of choice, a little bit of cinnamon. And that's a great way to sort of just start the day with a little bit of protein, a little bit of fiber. And then I also encourage them to maybe add like a side of berries, right? So something like that we can get into a little bit more smaller, something like our raspberries, where rich in fiber and those phytonutrients and those polyphenols. But I find that as a great bridge into getting your hunger back, easing into something without feeling like, oh my God, I'm eating breakfast and this is really stressing me out. And now is it the stress that's causing me to feel like this? Is it the food? And sort of just taking those small steps there. And then boom, you're getting in a little bit of protein first thing in the morning before maybe you take the next step of like delaying your caffeine an hour or two or eating breakfast first and then having your coffee. I think sometimes making too many changes all at once is just stressful, right? Because we're so accustomed to these things. So I find that to be just a great tool, that metabolism coffee, matcha, or decaf, as people sort of eased into things. And it was a really helpful transitional tool for me coming from a history of, being such an intermittent faster.
I love that like idea of kind of like, we don't need to jump to like, you're eating a full breakfast with like 2 full eggs and like sausage and, like greens and all of this stuff. And someone's like, I haven't eaten breakfast in like X amount of years. And it's like, okay, let's build like a bridge to that place. And, I think when we kind of thinking like we're saying like stress and we're talking protein and we're, maybe even, wondering now of like, what causes aging? What causes like some of those like challenges, in our bodies, and like why some of these strategies that you've kind of like helped to outline, like why are those helpful? Maybe if we start with like helping to kind of show like what are some of the big pieces of like this aging process in the body, because I feel like then it'll give more context to like why that protein and that fiber and that like stress and circadian rhythm, like why those are so profound when they feel maybe like someone's like, really? This is what's going to make a difference. Like, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So I think that's such a good point. And so like sort of what the research demonstrates, and I think what most of us can kind of know from like being in our bodies is I think the 2 biggest things that age us are stress and lack of sleep, right? So that lack of sleep is going to stress us out, and then stress further puts us on that roller coaster. And I think sometimes we think like, oh, my job has to be stressful, or I have to have a conflict with somebody in my family or a friend to be stressed. But we don't always realize that like, lack of nutrients, restriction, fasting creates these internal stressors. So I would say, and I mean, research continues to demonstrate that when we're sleep deprived, then we have elevated levels of cortisol. We're more likely to eat, more of these denser foods. So like those higher quick carbs with, more processed fats that were also internally leading to elevated blood pressure, right? Increased blood sugar, like postprandial glucose. There's actual research that takes subjects, puts them in labs, and kind of measures some of these serums, like or inflammatory cytokines, right? Or CRP, C-reactive proteins. And so all these inflammatory markers and our elevated blood pressure and blood sugar all over the map from things like lack of sleep and stress, right? Or under eating or skipping breakfast for women. It's a small study, but women who skip breakfast have elevated blood pressure and then stress hormones. And sure, there's going to be times I skip breakfast, I grab a coffee, I curse myself out later when I'm crashing, but it happens. But it's sort of like what we do habitually. And so then what does that mean long term? Well, if you're having elevated blood pressure and your glucose is out of control, and then we're looking at lipid profiles that are increasing, like we're at a risk for then metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease. And how does that impact longevity and aging? We as a population are living longer, but we're living sicker. In 2020, the World Health Organization said that diabetes was the 8th leading cause of death. By 2030, it's going to be the 7th leading cause of death. And this can be preventable through things like managing stress, sleep, lifestyle, dietary changes. And I think there's such a strong narrative on Instagram recently, like vegetables are going to kill you, like kale's going to kill you, do this, do that. And it's like, we become obsessed, like laser focused on these little things. And then we're not sleeping. We're on our phones in bed late at night. We're skimming on sleep to get in a 5 a.m., 6 a.m. workout class. And we're really missing the bigger picture. And if we look at populations like in Europe, they don't have as much stress as we do. They get like 5 weeks of vacation. They have a work-life balance. It's illegal to not take a lunch break in France, right? Like we lived in Switzerland. And I just remember like looking around being like, everybody moves so slow. Like what is going on? And it was like, no, they're just not stressed. Like they're having a lunch with a friend and they're not on their phone, and lunch is in 30 minutes. So getting back to your original question, I think sleep and stress, those two S's, are the two biggest things that are aging us as a population.
That was such a great explanation. And I think, something that I want to highlight or really drive home that you said is, really calling out the fact that stress is not just emotional. It's not just the acute stressors. Physical stressors are often what I think a lot of us see creating dysfunction and dysregulation in clients. And, in our modern world, and particularly in the US, it's more challenging, our food system and the, food that we have access to, the conflicting messages, and the fact that, we don't have, regulations that, mandate that we pause and, take a lunch break. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I've seen over the last couple of years since the pandemic that a lot has gotten worse, particularly with the work from home dynamic, where people are just grinding all day long, operating in that sympathetic state. So running on stress hormones as well, if, they're not fueling properly. And it's just creating this explosive dynamic that's driving chronic health conditions.
Like, am I alone when I think this? But like the idea of like we're stressed, it's like that when we say stress and so many people are like psycho-emotional, like what you were saying, like relationships or, challenges and like, it's like in our mind. But when we kind of take it to the physical world and it's like, well, actually it's like lack of sleep or you're like, prolonged fasting or your blood sugar's imbalance, like those feel like tangible. And sometimes like, I think when we start to educate to that, I feel like people are like, oh, wait, I have some control over the stress, because sometimes we don't, life happens. And sometimes like there are, things in life that you're like, man, this is really stressful and I can't really control this situation. And I can, there are obvious practices we could invite in and that conversation, but there's this whole category of stressors and the physical that exactly what you kind of just like really eloquently kind of laid out. That, when I think about it, I'm like, oh, like there's some, maybe it's like the Capricorn in me. I'm like, I can control those. Like,
no. And I think you're so spot on. And I think too, like kind of like just using my own personal experience when I was like really low carb and fasting, like, I didn't have like a lot of like, I wouldn't say like, I didn't have a lot of stress going on like externally, right? Like not a lot of like relationship stress or work stress. And I didn't realize like skipping breakfast, like what that does, right? We know that food brings up blood sugar, right? We get that. But then what's bringing up our blood sugar in the absence of food? Stress, things like cortisol, adrenaline. And then like taking it a step further, Well, it's a glucocortico. So if we're constantly in the state of stress, we're also in a state of catabolism. So we're breaking down our cell for fuel, things like muscle, like amino acid, right? And things like these key proteins, which make amino acids. And then taking it a step further, thinking about, how these other stress hormones interact with our gut and, how this can affect things in the lumen and our digestive tract. And that's just something for a long time I ignored and thought like, okay, I'm going to go to yoga and I'm going to do this and that. But I didn't realize my lack of nourishment and my fasting and my getting up early to get in all these workout classes, I was living like a man and really working against my physiology. And it didn't show up till a few months later too. I felt really great to start like running up these stress hormones, like, Tony Robinson, is that his name? I was like, yeah, I feel so great. And then all of a sudden, like, I started like losing my hair and I started like seeing these shifts and I'm like, maybe I just need to like shorten my eating window even more. Not realizing that like, all these whispers from my body was it trying to communicate with me? And I think sometimes, I say this to a lot of my clients, if we ignore the whispers from our bodies, eventually we'll have to deal with its screams. And I started to teeter on the screams before I was like, obviously like I was kind of in this like, seeking out studies to reaffirm my bias and all this stuff. And I had a professor in graduate school that challenged me and it was like in this echo chamber. And I'm really thankful for those people, but some people don't have that. And where they just push it and then they're forced to deal with these screams, right? They're forced to deal with these diagnoses and they're like, what the actual hell, how is this possible?
And they're confused, in terms of all of the kind of social media messaging and influencers. And it's mayhem out there in terms of trying to navigate, health on your own. And I think to even loop back to what you were mentioning, Sarah, about really starting from where you're at and taking like, baby steps. If everything that, Sarah and we're saying feels overwhelming, take that baby step and let your body adapt and see if it gives you evidence, right? Evidence that, hey, maybe I feel a little bit better or my digestion's a little bit more stable or, I'm noticing a little less anxiety and then it becomes motivating, right? When you get positive, signals and messages from the body. So, I think it's just, the kind of underlying message here of, listen to your body when Abby and I always say like the white flags are coming out before they become red flags.
Yeah. And there's so many little other things that you can build on from that. So one thing that really, I think it's important to note that hunger is circadian. It's called a circadian oscillator. So one thing that really helped me kind of like regain my hunger and sort of like re-step into like alignment, right? And for my body to feel safe is getting up in that morning, grabbing a mineral drink, going out for a long walk to sort of build up those hunger hormones, starting to eat that, like maybe it's that coffee with some Brazil nuts, and then you're working up to, a smaller breakfast or like a small smoothie, but continuing to do that for a week or so. So those hunger cues that ghrelin that, work on, they have these little clocks too, that those alarm clocks start to go off for them. And suddenly you'll start to feel hungry in the morning. And I remember like when I like started to wake up hungry in the morning, it was such an unusual feeling, but it felt really good because it felt like my digestive fires were there. It felt like things were starting to move. Bowel movements were happening normally. It didn't happen overnight. It took me like a month or two to get there. But when the lights started to come back on, it was like everything kind of came back in color. And for me, it was my mood too. Like I was in such a state of low blood sugar, which I think, we could talk about too. And I know you guys talk about this so much with your clients too, but that's just as dangerous as high blood sugar. And I was obsessive with my glucose monitoring and I wanted to stay low and I was anxious and I was reactive to so many people in my life because I was in this constant state of just subtly burning all these stress hormones and breaking down myself.
Yeah. I think to the kind of what we love that you talk about like so much is that this idea of like, what are these things that are making like the biggest impacts in terms of like that healthy aging for both the physical and the mental. And you just kind of like beautifully put a couple of them of like their habits. And you talk so much about this on like in Instagram and in your communities of like, they're the little habits that like consistently bring you back. And those are the daily practices, and we can deviate, just as you were saying, like, there are some mornings that I do have the coffees and I do, but it's like, those are the micro pieces, and we like start kind of with them. And so, thinking for if you were to kind of come up with like, what are your most, top 5 or something like that habits that like you really educate clients on and lead with, in terms of making the biggest impact for those that like, Benjamin Button aging?
So I love the book Atomic Habits. And I think what I really appreciate about what he does is he breaks things down into systems. So with all of my clients, I say, if you can get your morning system under control, the rest becomes so easy, because what we do in the morning, regardless of the sunlight, like from the first bite we put into our mouth, has such a profound impact on energy, digestion, blood sugar throughout the day. So if we can focus, I call it like the morning magic, if we can start to massage that area of your life and have different iterations, that can change your world. So what I would say, what my top habits would be, and I know you guys talk about this so much too, but start your day with some type of minerals, right? Mineral powder, make your homemade version, element, bumbleroot, like pickleball, like whatever you want to be, or I love like some aloe vera, some coconut. Do it the night before, have it out there. Have it like, when we were like little kids and we would get our book bags ready the night before, like my husband's always like, what are you doing? But like I'm getting my whole hydration station set up. So it's in your face. Or I just throw out like an element packet and I'm like, look, I don't have time for this. So you've got your morning minerals, get some form of sunlight when you wake up. It can be a sun lamp too, right? There's also a great app. I think it's called Luxer, Luxer, that if you hold it up to the sun on cloudy days, it shows you the amount of lux you're getting. And you're getting way more lux from that than you are from the lights in your house. If you're waking up before the sun, put on all your lights. So we've got minerals, we've got some form of light, protein within 1 to 2 hours of waking. So that could look like that metabolism matcha. It could look like an overnight oat bowl, some eggs. For some of my clients who are like, are kind of getting into the rhythm of eating, but they're not fully there yet, maybe they do 2 scoops of protein in their coffee or their matcha, and boom, they're getting 20 grams right there. And then they're working on the other things like delaying caffeine, having coffee after breakfast. So minerals, sunlight, protein, some type of just gentle movement to help improve that cortisol morning awakening response, right? So it could be jumping jacks, it could be, some stretching, sort of whatever feels right. And then I would say the 5th one would be, the 5th one that I would suggest to people is getting in some form of like easy digestible carbohydrate type of fiber, just to make sure we're getting in some simple variety to feed those gut microbes, to help with short chain fatty acids, butyrate, the whole gamut. And that could be like the berries. And that's where you can stack the habits, right? You can have this metabolism decaf with some raspberries, some cinnamon for blood sugar. Maybe you're adding on some Brazil nuts or some macadamia nuts, but boom, you can knock 3 things out before like 45 minutes in the morning. And then this will set you up for that success.
That sounds like a very, very lovely morning routine. And attainable too. I think breaking it down like that, and it's not that you have to start everything at once, but the way that you lay things out, I think it feels very approachable. And what I also love is that you focus on the things that are really going to move the needle with how people are feeling and how their body is supported first thing. So there is that positive, snowball effect the rest of the day, which is just really cool.
Yeah. And I think so, like, keep it so simple. So if someone's like, she just rattled off so much, take your mineral drink, go for a walk, or, roll out your yoga mat, drink that, make a matcha or your decaf coffee, throw some things in it, have a handful of berries. Like you just knocked off like 4 things right there, So I think like making it as easy as possible. So if a homemade mineral drink is daunting, boom, add some powder. If the whole metabolism matcha seems like a lot, just add a scoop of protein or have a couple hard-boiled eggs or make it work for you. There's definitely different variations. And then like you said, Jillian, like then the lights kind of start to come back on and then you start to like, you feel encouraged to adopt these habits and stay with them.
Yeah. And can you just give people a refresher in terms of, I feel like we talked a little bit about, benefit of actually eating, breaking the fast, not running on stress hormones all day, sunlight in terms of in training circadian rhythms, the mineral piece. Abby and I, definitely minerals probably come up in every single episode that we have recorded, but would love to, kind of just hear from you and remind listeners of why that, can be helpful and why that can feel really good to incorporate in a morning routine.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here with the minerals, right? This is diving deep into our coffee chats about our favorite mineral brands. But the easiest way to think of minerals without going down like a rabbit hole is they act as, spark plugs for the body, right? So when we ingest minerals, they function as electrolytes. They allow our cells to take in water. And I think, we focus on such sexy protocols and eliminating foods. We forget the basics of things like potassium and magnesium and how that helps to naturally balance blood sugar, right? And getting in sodium for the adrenals and things like stomach acid. So I like to think of minerals just as, just giving my body that extra fuel and supporting my body so simply and beautifully. And for me, minerals helped so much with energy, and the sodium, which I was afraid of for so long, helped so much with that stress response when I was so depleted. And then, and I know you guys talk about this too all the time. I think I like to kind of play with my minerals depending on my cycle, right? So I like to increase potassium in the later half of my luteal phase. And then I go back to my sodium during, more of that follicular phase. And obviously that's like more detailed for people. So I just really like to get, I think the easiest thing for people would be getting like a really good powder if they want to start with that, and then working on creating like a homemade version. But minerals, just, they do so much: digestion, mood, anxiety, all of those things, blood sugar, right? Which is such a hot topic for so many reasons. And I would, the thought of adding coconut water to my drink a few years ago, would have sent me over the effing edge, right? I would have been like, I'd rather just chug a bottle of wine and not, but we forget potassium, it's insulin effects, so these things. And so sometimes just shifting the narrative to a little bit of that education piece can shift the behavior a little bit. And that really helped me when I was just so focused on insulin and burning fat and all these things. I was the thought of coconut water and a banana would put me over the edge.
I totally feel that. I feel like it's and now we can laugh about it, which is great because it's all of this has come full circle. But I totally relate to that.
And I find now this has been the case for a long time, but the fear of sodium runs so deep. I think there's anytime someone's even just, using an example, they're watching the sodium. And I'm can we stop demonizing sodium? And it's people are oh, I had too much salt last night. I'm so poopy. And I'm it's because you don't have enough potassium and maybe not enough sodium.
Right? It's it's the seesaw. They work in a seesaw. It's when the bigger person, your older brother's on it and you're stuck at the top. And it's we just need to balance that out. It's so true. And here's a great little thing for people who track their HRV. What I see to have such a profound impact is when women get enough sodium, they start to see that trend go up because a lot of times we're burning through it. So for anybody who's out there oh, my HRV is just I can't get it up. Are you not eating enough sodium? It's going to be my first question.
That's a nice numeric for people to look at. And that would be on an Aura ring, seeing an HRV, or a Whoop band, or are there any other of the wearables that track HRV outside of those ones? And then there's some HRV dominant ones, but I think those are the only two that do the HRV directly. Too. Yeah. But I feel a lot of people have those. Yeah.
With my husband, he he gets great sleep. I got him a Whoop for Christmas and he's oh my God, my HRV is so bad. And then I gave him some Element, because he's not going to make a mineral drink at home. And he's look, I'm trending. And I'm I know, this is what I do for a living. It took you 3 years to get a Whoop and to want to even know what an HRV is. So that's just fun for people who are a little bit more data driven, where they're I don't know if I feel any different. Oh my God, I'm so puffy. And they're not, right? They're just, it's in their head, it's that psychological thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I think probably mind blowing to a lot of people, given, what a lot of us learned growing up, that stress depletes sodium and low sodium is a stressor, on the body. And it's this vicious cycle. And, I think particularly too, most people are going to benefit from this, but I'll work with a lot of women that are actively experiencing very aggressive salt cravings and resisting them, and the body is I need the sodium. I need the mineral support. I am stressed AF. And I just think it's interesting when the body actually tries to lead us to those things. And, is just way, way smarter than we are.
So true. And we ignore it because we've been told, Abby said, oh my God, sodium, I don't want to be puffy, and it's not realizing that our cravings are typically, we're lacking it.
And I think the habits that you talk about, the biggest beauty of them and what you've shared in your journey is they allow us to come back into alignment with our own intuition. that it's like all of a sudden like that like hunger starts to show up and you're like, oh, I had like a pride of like crushing my hunger forever. And then it's like, wait, actually this feels like there's energy happening in here. There's like a fire. There's, motility. There's like action. And it's like, that's happening, in our digestive system, that's happening in our brain, that's happening. And it's like, we actually feel, because energy is heat production. Energy is this like vitality. And it's like when we're white knuckling so many of these things, it's like most often it's like we're also then suppressing like even our own emotional intuitive connection to ourselves, because our intuitive connection is being like, please can we have some sodium and salt, and like please can we have some breakfast and like go to bed and like do these very fundamental things. And so it's really it's so much of a bigger conversation in a beautiful way than just it can be as simple as like have the protein and the minerals, but it also is like allow yourself to come back into alignment, like with who you were brought into this planet to be. And like, that's where it's like, when you get into alignment with that, you're like, oh, I've arrived. Like, and that, and that's when magic happens.
Totally. And I mean, the name of your podcast, Your Body Has Your Back, right? It's that safety feeling. I always say like, we can't heal something we don't feel connected to. When the body doesn't feel safe, like period problems, bloating, all these things occur. So there's something to be said about like your body having your back. And then when you feel safe, and you're out of that like constant stress, that flight or fight.
So the next thing that we would love to ask you is about balancing a social life and these healthy habits that we're talking about. Oftentimes in practice, we see clients in this feast or famine situation with weekends versus weekdays. And it almost ends up being this little mini form of yo-yo dieting where, what's happening during the week looks so different than what's happening on the weekends. And there's just this big disconnect. And, every Monday we feel like crap or, feel like we're starting at square one. So would love to hear how, you kind of focus on this yourself and work on this with clients in terms of achieving that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. I call those, and I was one of these, like my weekend warriors, right? Like the weekend comes around, it's like our 9 to 5's gone. We can relax. We can disrupt our rhythms. We can have tequila, all of these different things. And so I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I think the most important is keeping that morning routine to some extent. It doesn't need to look identical. What I used to do after a night out is I'd be like, oh, I had some alcohol, I ate too late. Well, now I'm going to fast even longer, right? To like help get rid of the toxins and do all these things. But if we can kind of shift the narrative to think about like how our organs actually work, like if you had a couple drinks last night, or maybe you had some processed food, your liver actually needs some support the next day. So keeping those foundations in place. So maybe your morning timing is a little bit off by like 90 minutes or so. But what mine typically would look like if I went out tonight, today's Friday, and then had a couple drinks, and then tomorrow I'm feeling kind of slow, I'd wake up, I'd have my minerals, maybe I'd hang out and journal for a bit, I'd grab my dog, we'd go for a walk. Through that walk, I'd start to feel a little bit of the calming from the sun, that gentle movement. My hunger starts to come back, and I would come home and I would properly break my fast with my meal centered around protein, right? Making sure I'm getting in those key amino acids, supporting the blood sugar, the liver, the gut, with, some colorful vegetables, some type of soul food, right? Maybe it's like an English muffin or a bagel or something, and then a little bit of fat. And I think it's so achievable when we kind of frame it like that and we give ourselves permission. And maybe I need a little extra support, so I'm grabbing a green juice with some dandelion in it, right? To help the liver with some extra phases. But just keep your morning routine. And maybe you need to add in some supplements, like if you were drinking, you do things like glutathione, and maybe the night before you go out, you have a little apple cider vinegar for its antimicrobial properties and blood sugar. And I know you guys geek out about vitamin E too, but I love to have vitamin E before I go out, right? And not only for like cycle health, but knowing it protects that mitochondria and that lipid membrane from those seed oils, which have become like it's the new celery juice, seed oils, right? And people are like, I can't go out to eat. And it's like, sister, live your life, have some vitamin E, find the balance, have a pre-dinner snack to bring up the blood sugar, turn up hunger hormones, some extra minerals, magnesium, and go to bed. And then let it go. I think when we set ourselves up, like think of yourself sometimes as an athlete, right? Like if you have a big game, you're going to do things to help prepare you. If I have an event, I'm going to make sure I'm eating enough during the day. I'm going to add in some apple cider vinegar, maybe some enzymes, a pre-dinner snack. Then I'm going to go to the main event. I'm going to enjoy myself. and I'm going to get back on the horse next day. And maybe it looks a little different, right? Maybe that morning on Saturday is a little bit longer and less structured, and that's fine. Maybe my things are out of order. Maybe I'm waking up, having breakfast, then I'm having minerals, then I'm going for a walk. So don't stress about that either. It's just sort of keeping them in play.
So many people are like, well, I was like, bad last night. I'm using quotes for anyone that's listening to the audio here. Like, so I'm going to do all of the good things. Like I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to hit a hard workout and I'm going to, do it fasted and I'm going to like do. When we think about that, the concept of stress that we kind of opened the episode with of like, we just had a stressful evening. Like, we were eating, drinking, maybe staying up later, like those were stressors in a different way. And so then it's like to put stress on top of stress on top of stress, like we're only going to kind of dig ourselves like deeper. And so many of the habits that you've been outlining are like, they're softer and they're invitations of things in, and they're actually helping to then the seesaw of balancing the stressors that we, created and made the choices around. And like, I like those stressors a lot personally, but it's like those other, it's like that seesaw of like, okay, we had some of those stressors. Let's bring in some of those invitations to help to support. And I just feel like I'm like, ooh, whenever, I started practicing those personally and really like working with clients and kind of having that, it's like, like our shoulders kind of can come out of our ears, that it's like, oh, yeah. Like I can like invite things in as opposed to like keep just wringing myself out every time.
It's almost a form of punishment when, we go out, we have, we deviate, we're having fun socially, and then we wake up the next day and it's like, I need to punish my body, deprive, restrict. And I think it's just important to call out that no positive health outcomes are going to be achieved through punishment and deprivation and restriction. Mm-hmm. And, what we're talking about here and what Sarah's describing is, again, working with your body, anchoring yourself, with some core habits. It's not about perfection, but being consistent with those anchors is what, is really going to give you the ability to have more resilience, to not feel so crappy after, deviating, and to, continue to progress with your health without having to like be a hermit at the end of the day, which isn't the point. We're not doing, these healthy things for our body to just be rigid and strict and to not enjoy life at the end of the day.
So true. And I think one of the most like underlooked things is like going for a walk the next day. I feel like, I used to be like after a night out, I'd do like a spinning class and a hot yoga, and I would just like go. And then I would crash and I'd be in bed the whole day. And I think walking is the most underutilized tool we have in our toolkit. I mean, for somebody who has dealt with anxiety their whole life, a walk outside is like my meditative movement. And it's even more important the day after drinking too. We get those negative ions from outside. We help to re-regulate that hunger. Also digestion, right? Like the less we move, the less our poop moves. So some of the gentle movement helps with that peristalsis. So like, I just think sometimes we just live in a society that's like hustle hard, do everything. And it's like, set your morning up for success. Then in the afternoon, if you want to add on like a sauna, I'm all for that, right? Mm-hmm. Like do some dry brushing. But like we keep saying, and you guys say all the time, like get your foundations in place and watch your life change. I mean, I saw my life change. I saw my body change. I saw my bloating change. I saw my skin change. I saw my hair start coming back and growing. And I think too, we forget, like, this is a terrible expression I use with my clients, but those toxic traits in our 20s don't carry over to our 30s. Mm-hmm. And we start to see shifts as women. And, I saw them and they're subtle, but then all of a sudden you're like, well, what's going on? And it's like, oh my God, I've been working against my body for the past 5 years. Now, we're dealing with some shifts in as early as 30, the loss of muscle. It's like, it's time to get shit in order now. So we're not 40 years old and looking back and thinking shoulda, coulda, woulda.
Yeah. And I think that the softening of, how do we get those habits? Like this is, you're so eloquent in putting them together. And I think the way that you educate to these are, that's why we've, asked you to come, because like your message is it connects with so many people, and in a way that is very like realistic and like sassy and approachable, and we're big fans.
Well, I'm a big fan of you guys, and I just think you guys say the same message. That's why we were kind of, when we all met in Boston in person, we clicked, but I think like, we're just so synchronized with what we're saying. It's like, I call it the art of doing less. And it is the first step is the most challenging step. As somebody who would do 2 workouts a day and do all these things, like, that first step to breakfast and that first morning reworking is the hardest. But once you start to do it and all of a sudden your inflammation starts to lower and you're like, God, I didn't need to lose like 10 pounds. I just needed to work with my body and go to the bathroom every day and have a good poop and be able to digest my food. It's shocking that we ever lived like that. Like, I cringe when I sometimes share my story. I like tense up inside. I'm like, oh my God, like, drinking 3 espressos until noon and wondering why my period was so painful.
Relatable, very relatable. Oh man. I mean, just really, really powerful stuff. And I think, our listeners are going to have a lot, to just get started with or to think about. And, it's just been really, really nice to hear from you, the way you approach things, and how you really support women, with creating these habits. And, to kind of wrap things up, we wanted to ask you, if you have kind of one final message or one main message that you'd like to drive home for our listeners, and not to put the pressure on, but if there's one takeaway or message that you'd like to share.
I guess the one takeaway would be, when it comes to your nutrition as a woman, healing your body slowly is the fastest way. And I know no one likes hearing that, but when you do the work and you get out on the other side and you realize that you can maintain and you can kind of coast and you can live your life. And for me, I can go out to dinner with my husband and not in the back of my head be like, how many calories is in this? How many workouts can I get in? Can I get into a hot yoga class the next day? It's the best feeling. And all of a sudden you have so much mental space. And I always also say you can't pour from an empty cup. So taking the time to do it right and just remembering slowly is the fastest way.
I love that.
I'm like,
that
preach!
That was killer.
Thank you.
What a great message to leave people with. And last question, where can people find you? Where can they connect with you?
You guys can find me at Nourish Thrive Glow NTG on Instagram and Facebook, and I have a website.
And you have a great membership and newsletter. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've got a lot going on and a lot to serve with people.
Thank you, Abby. Yes, I do a monthly membership where we do a topic every month. So you get a PDF guide, we do a Zoom session, and then we have a private Instagram, so separate from NTG, where every day I'm on there sharing things, sharing tips and tricks, what I do after a night out, what I do when I'm bloated, what I do when I'm human and I have a hard time and my mind is like, do it, restrict, fast, just do it, girl, just do it. And and I'm like, my intuition's like, girl, don't do it. So I share what I do with that because I'm still human and I still bloat and I still, have the ups and downs like any other human being in the world.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited to share this episode with the world and our internal coffee chats that we're having, or, matchas and decaf coffees, of course.
With protein, fiber.
A little bit of all the supports.
This has been wonderful. Thank you guys so much. It's always a pleasure. And I can't wait to hear this.
Thank you.